Well, this was kind of a step down from last week's episode. I'm a bit disappointed. Last week's episode got me so pumped to finally see a battle, and we don't see it. The episode instead opens after the battle, with Galadriel searching for survivors among the wreckage, and I'm sorry, I found this episode kind of boring and kind of dense. And that's the problem with adapting Tolkien, is that sometimes Tolkien can get really dense. And, it's a miracle that Peter Jackson was able to adapt it as well as it did. But this episode seemed very hard to follow, very hard to understand. I had to look up, recap summaries for people actually understood it, because there was a lot taken in this episode. But the stuff I got, the stuff that was probably the most interesting story in this episode was the dynamic between Durin and Elrond. And, Durin's father doesn't particularly like elves, and I like there's this kind of dynamic with Durin and Elrond that they're not supposed to be friends, but they choose to be anyway. And I also really liked Durin's wife's speech, where she's basically saying, you need to stop being prejudiced against the elves. So that was kind of a cool one. But what made me the most excited, though, was the end of the episode, where the villains are, I'm ruler of a place that no longer exists. What shall we call this place? And it changes from whatever the name of the place was to Mordor. Now, do we need an origin story for Mordor? Do we need to know where that name came from? No. But was it still kind of cool? A little bit of fan service? Yeah. Like I said, sometimes the show explains stuff that doesn't really need to be explained. Sometimes it goes a little bit like Captain Marvel or Solo, where it gives us answers to questions we weren't asking, but sometimes it can be kind of cool. Yeah. This episode overall did seem very filler. But next week is the finale, so hopefully it's exciting as last week's episode, because last week's episode was super exciting. It was probably one of the best episodes of the show. This was kind of a step down. Hopefully next week's episode is about as adrenaline pumping as last week's.